prolific researcher in multivariate methods and. He has also got an interest in stats education. Thank goodness. There are a few of us out there. So I've asked him to come and give his talk about the project that he underwent that is very novel in South Africa. Novel, lol, excuse the pun. So yeah, it's going to be great to hear from you, Johan. If you guys have any questions, let's not make it too formal. If you've got questions, you're welcome to interrupt us and we can make it a lively discussion in that event. Otherwise, over to you, Johan.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you for the invitation. I think it's imperative that most, if not all, individuals working in conventional academic statistics should have either a very direct interest in stats education, if not a direct interest in it, should have a direct appreciation of stats education. I think the speed at which we move in statistics, the teaching pedagogy aspects of it, diverse student bodies in front of us, diverse institutions, diverse branches. There's just too much variability for us to not take our job of instruction seriously enough. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my interests, which is somewhat orthogonal to my usual research efforts, but it's something that I think is still very interesting, and it's something that I have a product of. I will show you the hard copy towards the end. I titled this The Development of an Anthology of Fictional Short Stories in University Level Statistics, and then append to that as an inclusive pedagogical strategy. Because this was not a project born out of the aim of to produce an output. There was a project born with the aim of encouraging alternative trains of thought in the teaching and or engagement and or experience of statistics. So that's kind of where it came from, and that's how it's been developing. It's growing into an incredible monster in my life, but it's one of those monsters like I like to think of the dragon in Shrek. Perhaps initially misunderstood and eventually becoming a very lovable character and a companion in my statistics career. So let's see. I'm going to talk. I mean, this seems like a lot of points. It seems conventional to just say I'm going to talk. There's going to be a little bit of introduction. I'm not going to ask anybody here to do anything, but there will be 2 or 3 times I'm going to give you an opportunity and maybe some 8, 9, 10 seconds worth of reflection time just to briefly think about 1 or 2 things. I want to describe some literature, but I'm very happy to share the slides or the references. The references are at the end. If anybody wants to go and read up about anything specifically, I don't want to stop at the literature as such. There's 1 or 2 major points in literature that I want to mention out loud that frames the need for this, especially at the tertiary or at the university level, that is not maybe that well covered in literature otherwise. I have their context, and then I also have something that I want to say about cognitive context. So up to this point, it's going to be a little bit broad in terms of how we think about creativity in the engagement and or experience of statistics. Then I'm going to zone in around point 5 when I get to a little bit about something that I was involved in, something that I piloted, something that I'm still working on. I want to mention 1 or 2 things of my thoughts when it comes to what science communication mean and how this project feeds naturally or rather organically into the idea of how we communicate and how we can think about science, sure, but also statistics, and statistics not in the official statistics or, unemployment rate of the past 10 years, but about the discipline as a cohesive whole and what our interests would be and how we can communicate that in a feasible and interesting and engaging way. Wrap up with some conclusions and then 1 or 2 things at the very end that I also would want to share. I think the first point of departure for me is to think that at the end of the day, or let me rather say, at the start of the day, at the dawn of time, I think humans have been incredibly moved and completely dependent on the idea of what storytelling means, of how we engage with life, how we engage with each other, how we, this was already done by the Greeks thousands of years ago. The stories of Homer, the stories of Plato, Aesop, the Khoisan in a local sense, or in a regional sense at least, the Khoisan. Stories give meaning and a sense of belonging to where we are in life, what we do and how we interact to what life throws at us. And if we take that to ourselves personally, if you just want to take a moment to think, what is your favorite series, your favorite film, one of those that you can watch over and over again, a story from your childhood that you can recall. If you want, you can just pencil it down in a corner or margin of a paper in front of you. Character names and settings that really stand out to you. For me, one of those that stand out is Winnie the Pooh and Friends, is a story that I spent a lot of time with when I was a child. And all of that, the setting where that played off was in the 100-Acre Wood. And then, is there a specific plot line that stands out to you from your favorite story? For example, something like Eeyore gets stuck in a tree. Eeyore is, of course, a character from Winnie the Pooh, and how the team tries to keep him calm and to get him down. Obviously, this is a story that I remember, even if it was 30 odd years ago when I first encountered it, but it made an impression on me, and it made a sense, it gave me a sense of how they interact with each other and how I could interact with others. But there's a story to this, and it's something that emotionally resonated with me. The feelings that you experience when you look at these type of stories, I think, is valuable to think of. There's some anxiety. Eeyore is stuck in the tree. It's scary. There is a resolution. They get him down. We're all friends. The emotion that goes with this, I think, is important to acknowledge, that stories empower us in this way. I think it's important to think, what does a sense of belonging mean to each of us in our teaching or research? Eventually, I'm going to flip this and say, have we ever thought what sense of belonging means to the students in front of us? And are they experiencing a sense of belonging in our class? Of course, there is somewhat of a stratification that can happen, because some students would be in the class by choice and some would be in the class not by choice, because stats for the biological sciences or agricultural sciences or something to that effect would be a forced core module, for example, instead of an elective. But I think it's important that we reflect on what does sense of belonging mean in my teaching, in my research, in yours, and how a student would experience that as well. And then, just out of interest, would you consider yourself to be a storyteller? I don't mean that as a loaded question. I don't mean that in a teaching or research context specifically, but just in general, what is a sense of, how do you consider yourself a storyteller? Is it something that comes naturally to you? Is it something that you feel is sometimes a bit forced? And why or why not would you feel that way? In the analytical sciences specifically, storytelling is something that actually happens all the time. Okay, let me rephrase. Storytelling is something that happens all the time at young and introductory levels. Let me rephrase. Storytelling is something that happens at young and introductory levels, usually at the primary school level. Michael has 12 pumpkins and gives 7 of them to Johan. How many pumpkins does Michael have left? If we think about that, it immediately creates a story. It immediately creates characters. It immediately creates some kind of plot line. But at the end of the day, what the learning aspect here is immediately tied to something about sum, or rather subtraction in this case, to think about how that works mathematically. There's a lot of work that is done, of course, of fictional narratives or short stories or storytelling concepts at the primary level, some in the secondary level, but almost none at the tertiary and postgraduate level. When I say tertiary and postgraduate, in this case, I specifically refer to the analytical sciences as a whole, not necessarily as for a specific branch or for a specific module or class in statistics. As a whole, there's not so much that's really going on. it's important to think when exactly was the last time that we were forced. Okay, forced is maybe a bit of a strong word. Let's say encouraged. When we were encouraged to use critical thinking in an conventionally creative way. Creative meaning attach it to a story, attach it to music, attach it to dance, attach it to something that is more quote unquote conventionally expressive. Not so recently. My pumpkin analogy here is one of the immediate examples that came to mind, but that is something that we would have done at the age of 5, 6, 7. There's a lot of literature that we can cover and that we can describe here. I don't mean to really go into the nitty-gritty of all of this. When we get to something like narrative storytelling in the mathematical sciences, there's been some movement in the past few years. And the value of that, of course, is that you are supplementing a particular cognitive area and the development and experience of that discipline or focus in that area with strong skills that you might have had in another area, which is conventionally or usually not cross-pollinated in a meaningful way. And then there's a different kind of biochemistry type of science behind storytelling. Cortisol, oxytocin, dopamine, all of these are heightened when we start thinking about a story. Some of these are also, of course, involved, specifically in our case, when we start thinking about teaching statistics. But teaching statistics, of course, usually evokes a sense of fear into most. It's a fight or flight response, and actually very few fight, and some of them actually end up fleeing. And to address that in a meaningful way, I'm thinking that storytelling could be a valuable point of consideration for how people learn, and at the very least, how people experience what statistics could be like. There's a lot of focus, as I've mentioned before, when you think about elementary education, primary school education. Storytelling seems obvious because we have this idea of characters. We immediately attach it to an idea of human interaction. We resonate stories or concepts that we learn immediately mapped to a world that is tangible and not yet so abstract. There's Michael and Johan. There's a pumpkin transaction taking place when it's actually just a mathematical sum or mathematical teaching tool to that effect. There was some indication or some investigations when it gets to storytelling in higher education, and there is some convincing evidence that it is an effective teaching and learning tool. And here, especially for those students who have a higher memory ability. So this idea of knowledge retention comes into play as well, and how what we learn can be retained for longer instead of just cramming and regurgitating concepts without really truly understanding what we are doing. In specific thing that stood out for me in that specific reference was that storytelling is a vehicle to make meaning of one's understanding and of your learning experience. I think that is something that's very important because it's something that I know myself up to about 3-4 years ago. It's not something that I've particularly paid that much attention to by the time that I teach large courses or really any course for that matter. This making meaning of your understanding and making meaning of your learning experience is essential, coupled with what I mentioned earlier when, let me just try to the first slide about giving yourself a sense of belonging in the class that you're sitting in the content that you have to cover, in the degree that you have that you want, and then eventually leading into a fulfilling career and a fulfilling life after that. So in this context, I want to reflect briefly on when you sit down to write, any of you here, what do you write? When we say I can't, I'm writing. Let's just think, what exactly are we writing? Are you writing a paper? Are you maybe writing a dissertation or a thesis? Psychologically, those two are not the same, at least in my view. Are you writing a grant application? Are you writing a popular article? And then how do we approach writing? What does writing mean? We are familiar with basic concepts like exposition or development or denouement. In conventional terms or in storytelling terms, we will often call that something like introduction, body, conclusion, which is very paper-based, at least how we would often start a paper, academic paper with. In a storytelling context, that translates to something like exposition, development, and the denouement. And if we have to think, how does this connect or relate back to what we are trying to convey or learn? In this case, we have to think, actually, are we actually telling a story? When I'm trying to convince someone to give me research money, I have to tell a good story. I know it's not, I'm not making characters, I'm making a plot line, I'm making a villain, I'm not doing that. But obviously the challenges, if you have to describe challenges in your NRF application, those could be equated to what a villain would be in your story. The characters would be you as the principal investigator or you as the staff member. Your compatriots would be your postgraduate students, your other collaborators, and the plot line would be the issue of the research that you are trying to address. And you want to emerge as victorious at the end of the day, and you have to ward off the challenges. You have to ward off the villain. So in that way, in a story context, I think that it actually ties in very closely to what we write on a regular basis. I think it's important to think or to confirm to ourselves. I'm not trying to, I actually am trying to convince you, but I will leave your final conversation to yourself. Is storytelling of value in our academic context? Should we even pay attention to it? And an important aspect that I saw, that I read here, other than my own personal view, which I am in favor of course, is that science helps us identify problems, understand their extent, find solutions. But the last sentence here, yet the vividness of these experiences is often left out when scientists talk and write about their work. The excitement, the story, the coloring slightly beyond the lines. We would say it's a sunny day today, but we do not describe necessarily how bright the sun is. Shades of orange and yellow and red that we see during dusk, stuff like that. And I think that brings me to ask, what really do we keep in mind when we are writing? Thesis, dissertation, grant, popular article, and I add there in brackets, other than sheer desperation, because oftentimes I think many of us are motivated by a deadline and by desperation. There are some concepts, there are many others. These are some examples that I think are important to think of by the time that we think what makes for good writing. Clarity is imperative. Persuasion, we should be making a strong point. For example, to make that no on your grant, to make it a yes. Contextualization, etc. All of these. Publication impact is something that we need to consider, because if you want to read it, you are more likely to want to cite it, I think. I do not have a reference for that. That is just my own personal experience and view on it. The humanization aspect for me is very important. And that ties back to how we experience word sums when we are 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. We do not say just 12 minus 7. We say Michael has 12 pumpkins and he gives 7 of them to Johan. How many pumpkins does Michael have left? And I think it's because we are humanizing it, because it's something that even as 5, 6, 7-year-olds, we can relate to very closely. And I think there's value in how we can think about it in that way. Is this academic writing, or is this just not actually any storyteller? I think that's an important thing to think about. Any of our favorite Netflix series, our favorite novels, anything artsy that we engage with is usually built around key points that are meaningful to keep in mind by the time that we are writing. And when we think about what it means in a cognitive context way, I think it's valuable to think these context of emotional engagement, visualization, coherence, that's relevant to any story, whether it's your Netflix story, whether it's your thesis, whether it's your paper, whether it's your class experience, and how we can benefit from this in a better way than we might have thought of previously. The nice thing about this, of course, is that formal learning in an undergraduate context, for argument's sake, or research is framed within an informal way. And the humanization, I think, is a huge important aspect to how that makes it more accessible for those who might historically have been a little bit warded off by different kinds of fears, especially, at least in our context, of teaching statistics. And then I'm reminded that this all started, the Greeks have been doing this for thousands of years. The griots in West Africa, the storytellers, have been doing it for thousands of years. it's a very human thing to do, and yet it's not something that we in an academic sense actually think about often enough. I mean, outside the realm of doing a master's or a PhD or something like that in creative writing or in languages, I imagine. In my specific context, I want to just share a little bit about what I actually did and why I think this is a valuable proposition. I just want to, I usually want to set the scene just to make sure that we're all at least on the same basis of what exactly is time series analysis. And the valuable thing about time series analysis, I think to a large extent more than many other branches of statistics, is that the result of time series is common in many areas all of us see. A few months ago, we had this story on MoneyWeb about inflation hits 4-month high. And now you're thinking, okay, Johan, what does that exactly have to do with time series? But it's because popular media articles often have some variable that is plotted over time. And of course, here, this immediately brings us to this idea of a series of values. I want to analyze, I need to understand a series of values, series analysis. Okay, the x-axis always has a measure of time as on a linear scale, seeing how things change over time specifically, which brings us to what the study, the sub-branch at least, of time series analysis would be. The background in terms of an undergraduate context and the tools and methodology that we use to teach how to understand this data over time. In the University of Pretoria context, it's an 18-credit third-year module of about 300 students with a very diverse student body. In this case, there are BSc Math Stats, BSc Actuarial Science, BCom Stats and Data Science, BCom Economics, etc. At WITS, where I am now, it's a 14-credit module taken by approximately 120 students, mostly from the Actuarial Science group and also some in the Mathematical Science cluster as well. In context of our statistical framework, what is covered, we look at mostly univariate time series, properties, autoregressive, moving average type of models, estimation, forecasting, residual analysis. So mostly the usual Box-Jenkins methodology. And then I say the theory of autocorrelation. I put in theory in inverted commas, not because I think there's no real theory behind it. What I probably should be putting the inverted commas around is actually the autocorrelation, because time series is based on this fact that I have a variable that has something to do with itself in the past as my predictors when you view it from an applied regression context. So the whole world of time series, in my opinion, only actually revolves around the auto of the correlation structure and seeing how those kind of things interact with each other. In my specific example that I did, so up to now, I've made this case for storytelling. I hope you kind of sense that. I believe in storytelling. I like to tell stories. I am enamored by stories. I read a lot when I was younger. So I hope I've made a strong case for the aspect that storytelling can be considered more often and more seriously, especially in a tertiary context, because of the many advantages that it would have. For the project that I initialized, students voluntarily participated in a storytelling assignment. So I want to say assignment, mostly because it was voluntary. It was not something that was forced. I just asked them to do it, where I wanted them to make key time series analysis concepts as characters. And I gave them a non-restrictive and non-stringent brief or guidelines, if you'd like, on how to write it. A question that I often would get about this in the early stages was, why exactly did you do this? Where does this even come from? Mostly this came from, it was completely born out of frustration, especially considering that it was a very large group, 300 students, and at some point, all students lose all hope for hopefully passing something like time series analysis, or at any point in time, especially considering that it's a second semester module in the third year of study. So everybody's a bit exhausted at that point in time. Trying to rile up 300 horses to run a race for the November exam is not an easy job. So I wanted to give them something in order to see, can I stimulate engagement in a meaningful way? The other challenge, of course, is that we live in an era of instant gratification. We are used to immediately getting a response via GAI or via Google or via Wikipedia And then, of course, that we have significant screen time that we are all exposed to, but the students of today much more than, for example, when I was an undergraduate student. So in an effort to try and literally divert eyes away from a screen, even for just a short time, to then also engage with the work in a meaningful way is what I try to achieve. Out of interest, I saw somewhere Gen Alpha is sometimes described as screenagers. And I think at that description, I think many of us are actually guilty of that as well. I know, I mean, I'm looking at you on this screen. My slides are on this screen. I have another screen over here. So we are just surrounded by this hideous blue light every time. If it's not on the phone, it's on the iPad. If it's not on the iPad, it's on the TV. It's not the TV, it's the computer screen. And to take time away from that, take your shoes off, put your bare feet on grass, put pen to paper. I try to at least experiment with trying to make learning happen that is not necessarily only screen dependent. A key question that I tried to reflect on was, how can I inspire students to think about the course content in a previously unconsidered way? And I wanted to think about learning in a learning context about how do we activate alternative cognitive pathways? How do we make neurons fire to still reach my goal of delivering a time series knowledge environment, but in an interesting and somewhat orthogonal way than at least what we're used to? So I mentioned that students were invited to contribute such a short story on a voluntary basis. Out of a class of 300, I got more than 30 submissions. And for me, that was an incredible win to have more than a 10% response rate for something that was not forced. If it was forced, I probably would have gotten a lot of very laborious stories to read through, let me phrase it like that. I specifically asked students consent to use and or publish this in some meaningful way. And so finally, what I'm actually getting at, the product that developed, even though the product was not the goal initially, was that this was published as a contributed volume storybook, fully illustrated as well. I'm happy to say it has been illustrated by a human. It was not illustrated by AI. And the book is available completely open access. You can Google Fiction and Fable Tales of Time series. And but I have a link at the end, or I have a QR code at the end of the slides that you can scan and access it as well if you'd like. So I have to say, what exactly then did I ask the students? What exactly was this brief? I asked them write a narrative of approximately 1,000 words. That's about a 1.5 A4 page, as if it were a bedtime story for a younger sibling or a cousin or something like that. The story has to use characters from our time series class content. Your story must have a main character and a villain, and can be set in a fictional or real world country or place of your choosing. Particular things that I want to look out for is, number one, there are specific characters or places with direct relation to time series concepts. For example, an ARIMA 010 model is a villain. Of course, the implication being the unit root causing the process to be non-stationary. That's the villain. There's a natural link between the story and the course content. I want something that is well structured, and the story must end with some resolution. It cannot just end up in the air. For example, the main heroine defeats the evil wizard, something to that effect. I also added to tell them, you do not have to be a great writer, because I was wary that students might say, I'm not going to do this optional thing. I can't write. What do I know? But I wanted to avoid them feeling like that. Obviously, it was voluntary. They did not have to do anything, but you do not have to be a great writer. You just be yourself, and you need to want to be a little bit creative. And you can write this narrative in your home language or in English. And if it's in a language different from English, I commit to trying my best to find a suitably translated version. Obviously, this is important for me. Out of a class of 300 at UP, for example, there are students in that class whose fourth language is English or third language is English. So that's tough. Also, then for them to make sense and to find a sense of belonging is easier in your mother tongue than otherwise. This is what the cover looks like, fully illustrated by a human, Michelle Pinto. I think she's a phenomenal illustrator. And this is an example of one of the stories, ZT and the Shadow Spawn by David Dodkins. He was a brilliant student, past student in my class. And it's really great to experience how many people actually engage with time series content in a different way than we're used to. In this case, ZT is the main character, and he had a bracelet or an amulet that changed as time goes on. The inscription on the amulet changed, and eventually it became something, at some point, it became a moving average process. And the character, ZT, comes to the realization of being grateful for his ancestors because, and the mistakes that he's made in his past. And he says, oh, I'm actually a function of my past errors. And as profound and as poetic as that sound, I think it's an incredible way of thinking about what the moving average process is, at the very least, when it's being taught to someone unfamiliar with the concept for the first time. And I think there's a lot of value in seeing how students themselves view it. And for a student, future student, to not only believe Johan's voice and Johan's notes, but to see that it has been experienced and digested by a fellow student in a different way in the past as well. When you go and find it online, the entire book is available on the ESI website. QR code will be at the end, but you can just Google Fiction and Fable Tales of Time series. The full PDF is available, but you can download each individual story as well by itself. And then in the editorial at the start, I describe a little bit of context about why how this project came about, what it meant, what I envisaged the impact to be, what I think objectives would have been, and to give a little bit of context literature-wise on why this would be valuable in a tertiary education environment specifically. A question that I also have gotten in the past was, okay, Johan, big deal. Now you have this book. So what do we do now? And many others have asked me as well, okay, so are you going to make another book? And because my intention initially was not to create the book happened because of the assignment that was so magical in the outcome eventually. My intention would not be to just create more books, because I mean, what is a book if no one's going to read it? Number one, I think. So then the year after it was published, I made this, or I asked students in a subsequent course, okay, here I have 4 stories. I chose 4 stories that covered concepts up to that point in time in the semester that we've covered already. And I asked them, please read any one of these 4 stories and give me some feedback. Do you feel like this could be a learning resource? Do you feel like this could be beneficial to you as a complementary resource in the context of your time series journey or learning? I asked some students of this, and for example, in the first case, I asked, I appreciate seeing and learning different concepts of time series analysis through the eyes of other students. I just gave them 3 options: absolutely, somewhat, or not really. In all of these 3 cases for different questions, the overwhelming majority of students indicated that they found that this is a very valuable, or at the very least, could be a very valuable consideration for how they experience their time series learning journey going forward. And I think without this type of feedback, implementing the book, otherwise it would have just been a very cute little product, and it's on my bookshelf, and so what? The real value in this is actually putting it back into the system and seeing how students react to this as a learning resource. And then potentially, of course, it's written in such a way, it's not University of Pretoria or the University of the Witwatersrand specific. In this case, it is time series specific or introductory time series specific. And I think that there's value in how we can phrase this in a meaningful way in any introductory time series course at any South African, almost want to say any global institution where time series is being taught at an undergraduate level. And that brings me to thinking a little bit shortly about what exactly does science communication mean? Because in this way, these short stories are written in such a way that, number one, you do not have to be a time series student, because the brief said that Write it as if you are telling a bedtime story to a younger sibling or a cousin of some kind. So how we describe it, you do not actually need to know a lot about statistics to read and or appreciate and or enjoy these stories, but there's value in how we are communicating that in which students are experiencing often in a class with those around them in a way that is not jargon heavy or that requires a BSc or a BCom in statistics in order to understand. So when we think about how we as lecturing staff or in industry, when we think about communication, I think that this idea of storytelling is central to what we describe and consider daily as writing. Science communication, does it just mean publishing something in the conversation? Do we just do that for the brownie points because the university likes it? Or do we actually think about, is this an interesting way to think about what I spend a lot of my time doing to the better of mankind, to the better of humankind? Or for students, is it participating in FameLab, where you also have 3 minutes to describe a complex research project to a lay audience or a non-specialist audience? So all of these are aspects of science communication, and at the end, introduction, body conclusion, or exposition, development, denouement are key factors in how we can communicate effectively, because that is how we are raised in our Netflix, in our Winnie the Pooh, in our whatever stories lines that we consume otherwise on a regular basis. I think this, of course, has an effect on how we share our research or our daily activities with friends and family. When somebody asks you, oh, you work at the university, so what exactly do you do? And trying to describe that in a way that is, number one, informative, number two, scientifically correct, number three, not patronizing, number four, some way of how we can resonate or how we can get our friends and family to resonate with what we spend our time on, I think is extremely valuable. As some final points of reflection, I think this book, at least in my case, as a newly developed and novel in the tertiary statistics context, critical engagement with the course material is enhanced because we get to think of a moving average process, not necessarily just as a linear or convex combination of white noise terms, but we can see it as a character or an individual or a thing that is a function of its past errors. Without trying to sound particularly soppy, but it's a beautifully poetic way of thinking about it. But that's what the moving average process actually just theoretically is written down as. What's valuable as here as well is how this gives entrance into a decolonial pedagogical type of result. The course content is owned by students because they were the ones who actually wrote the stories. Why I edited it in a way to make sure that it's somewhat scientifically correct and that there's no superfluous type of words, redundant phrases, aspects. It's a big job. The editing actually took me a while to edit it in a meaningful way. But how students took ownership of that and authority of content was incredible to see. There are students who used some stories from their childhood, from where they were raised. There were students who wrote stuff in a sci-fi context. There were students who wrote stuff by rearranging some stories of the Brothers Grimm, which means that there's a wide array of entry points in how you can think about statistical thinking and what ownership of your studies mean to you. And I think there's a very direct consequence and effect of how this means we interact with science in general, not only in Johan's time series context. It's very useful for Johan in his time series context. But I think the reflection on storytelling and giving that a little bit of airtime emotionally for us benefits us in way more areas than we might care to admit initially. And then I have a last bullet point there, something about translation. And I'm very, very thrilled to actually share that hopefully by next week, I'm going to receive the translated version of this whole book. I got funding in order to translate it into 3 more languages. Currently, it's in English. And then hopefully by the end of next week, I have the first draft of the translated copies of an Afrikaans copy, of a Setswana copy, and of a Sepedi copy. And I think the value in that itself is to consume and learn about content and context of what our student body actually has to attend in class, in a mother tongue, in a storytelling context in which they were raised, makes a big impression. Of course, I want to mention also, I don't only expect a third-year student in time series analysis to read these, but for these stories to be consumed, because it's written, remember, for a younger cousin or a sibling. So the story is edited and written in such a way that it should be fairly accessible to anyone. Also, for a matric level student who does not know, they want to study something with math, but they don't know what. And to create more opportunities for English or Afrikaans or Sepedi or Setswana students who would enjoy and or consume this and maybe think, wow, this is really quite cute. Maybe I should go and study statistics. So as a reach out to the next generation of statisticians in their home language in our country, I think is incredibly valuable point of reflection as well. This is, for example, for the Sepedi version, what the table of contents would look like. This is one of the stories, and Ndango was also, of course, in my class, and I remember her story was really cute. It's entitled, "Can You Cross the Bridge?" And I just wanted to illustrate one or two of the examples of the translated stories and as well the accompanying illustrations with it. Recently, I also wrote about this in the conversation in order to not only tick a box for my own job, which it inevitably and fortunately does, but to empower a broader awareness of what storytelling could mean, and in order to get people to access the book and to see what it is about, and that maths, or let's say very specifically statistics, okay, in this case, very specifically time series analysis, is not supposed to be a very scary environment. It's supposed to be something that can be quite intuitive, and it can be something that is phrased within a conventional storytelling aspect that we are all actually quite familiar with since we were very young. So when you think of where to go to from here, what all of these storytelling aspects, it can mean a lot for your formal writing, your teaching approaches. I'm not sitting here trying to tell everyone, oh, you should be using Johan's time series short story book in your context. That's not really what I mean. You are welcome to. Of course, it's an open access book. But the value here is to think, to just toy with an assignment where students would do this. Of course, the effect is not only for the next cohort of students reading a previous student's story, but the learning experience of the student writing the story during that course and how they make sense of what's going on, and to give them a sense of belonging in their own words of where they are situated within the course context. Of course, this means a lot for how any of us approach the conversation type of paper, or writing for Quest magazine, the magazine of the academic SASA. My English has left me now. Students participating in FameLab, or when you are writing an opinion piece for a news publication. I want to say thank you to COE Maths, who also gratefully funded this, SASA Education Interest Group. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation. I'm going to leave the QR code up if you struggle to find a link to the book otherwise. There are some references here as well, and I'm very happy to share these with anybody who might want to see it. And that is the summary of my project and broader idea of what storytelling could mean in an academic context.
Thanks very much, Johan. That was very nice. I'm so glad I got to see this talk again. I saw it very briefly at one of the conferences back in the day. I'm so glad I got to see it at a much slower pace, because I could make notes and a lot
Also
of the
because
things.
here, yes, because now I had about 45 minutes
Yeah.
versus a 16-minute time slot where I had to talk it was at SASA last year where I had to rush and I could hear, sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No, that's fine.
I think I could give a little bit more context about storytelling in a general sense of who we are as humans and how we can whittle and funnel that down into forming meaning by the time that we don't only think about our own research or our teaching, but a student in my class's experience of my teaching. So I hope that was kind of the goal, yes.
Yeah, so before I open up the floor, if anyone's got questions, I just want to give my 2 cents. There's 2 things about this work that really strike me. The first is the one that's more evident, and it's the idea of creativity and allowing students to take ownership of the content, that this idea of decoloniality and a new etymology and that sort of thing. That's the one side of things, the creative aspect of it. But I'm also now, because I've done a lot more work on the cognitive side, I'm struck by the idea that storytelling improves memory retention. And suddenly it clicked for me. It makes a hell of a lot of sense, because the topics in my own courses that come across the best are the ones that have stories attached. Now,
I believe that.
I understand that on the creative side of things, it's very different to the stories that I'm telling in my modules. But the fact is, one of the greatest stories on linear regression is that of the Challenger disaster, where they did not analyze the data correctly, and a basic linear regression would have saved those astronauts, right? And it's a tragic story, but it's something that everybody remembers in my class, right? And even the story earlier of the T distribution, the fact that it's called a student's T is a story. Yes. That William Seeley Gossett was working for Guinness in Ireland and in Dublin, and he could not put his name to his paper. So it was called the student's T. I mean, 100%. These stories, the story of the normal distribution, the central limit theorem, it's a 200-year story. And that's why it sits so nicely in people's memories, right? It's a story. And the fact is, when we give these topics meaning in that way, it does give us better memory retention. And maybe that's why, humans grew up telling stories. How 100%. We evolved telling stories. It was just easier to make an impression.
Yes, because one thing that immediately from what you said now, I often, every semester, when I'm teaching a different group of students, I always tell the story of Gossett and the T distribution, because it has a bit of a humorous aspect to it, the whole thing about in the brewery and at Guinness and so on and so forth, and he was scared of being ridiculed, so he just said he's a student, so it became known as student's T, because we students, no pun intended, see in textbooks and in tables or wherever it's always student's T, and there's no context for what does that mean, because then they think it actually refers to them, which it doesn't. No, and I tell them, no offense, but this is not about you. It's actually about William Gossett. Yeah. And that makes a big difference. And then when you even get to different test statistics, when you're testing for unit, okay, I'm thinking now in a time series context, testing for unit roots and so on, you have something like a studentized test statistic. Because studentized means actually this approach of a t-test about something minus something under the null hypothesis, and you scale it using some kind of standard error. That is studentization, for lack of a better term. But studentized is a strange verb. But if you know that comes from student's T, that comes from student, that comes from William Gossett, that comes from this, there's a bigger dream behind it, or there's a bigger story behind it. And I think that immediately creates a completely different experience of engagement for anybody in a class. And from what you've said now also, when I say here telling stories, the implication, and I completely agree with you, the implication here is not to only have students write a story about the content, but it's about telling a story, even if it's about the O-rings in the Challenger disaster, even if it's that very overly analyzed data set about the deaths on the Titanic, or about this history of student, or from William Gossett, it immediately creates a sense of enamorization, retention, and it's an orthogonal interest to just the density function of a normal, for example. So it completely changes how we think and dream, and how we emotionally tactile we are to this type of information.
But it almost makes me feel like we should be looking for, I mean, now you have a whole set of stories that engage the creative aspect as well, but we should be looking for stories that make the telling of all of our statistics methodologies, more interesting. We should be identifying and sharing them, because it's not just to make your classes better. It is literally about the cognitive aspect that
100%.
it creates better memory retention. I mean, it's as simple as that.
I completely agree. That's 100% the truth.
Anyway, are there any comments or questions from our handful of guests? I don't know if anyone was even listening, but I don't care, because I got to listen to you for a little while longer than I did at the conference. So for me, it was worth it.
I really enjoyed it again, Johan.
Oh, thank you, Andre. I appreciate that.
Oh, other question I wanted to ask is, what sort of feedback did you get back from the ISI? Because those guys are really into the education thing, so I was very impressed.
I was I was very pleasantly surprised. Of course, what I'm going to say something somewhat contentious, or some people might consider what I'm about to say somewhat contentious, that projects like this draws a big crowd. But my own research that I spend a lot of time on never draws this kind of crowd, or doesn't encourage this type of critical
engagement
discourse afterwards. Yeah, I mean, but I suppose that's just how life is. I was incredibly fortunate to have received extremely positive feedback, exclusively positive feedback at the ISI. And there was a high school teacher who's doing his PhD in stats education, who came to me afterwards, and he said he can't wait to do this with his grade 11s because he's just never thought of it this way.
Fantastic.
There was a stats education expert from Auckland in New Zealand who was there, and we had almost an hour-long discussion about different aspects of storytelling and what that means for cognitive behavioral changes of experiencing knowledge with a stats-specific focus. There was a researcher, professor from the Technical University in Delft, which was by comparison just down the road from the ISI. And she just said, like, I need to see the Afrikaans version because she's Dutch. She said, like, this is something that's very interesting to her. And Bruno de Souza also came to me afterwards, and he said this is thrilling. He would love to have a version in Spanish.
Wow.
And then I told him, you can have a version in Spanish. Go do it. I don't want to come across as somebody like, oh, Johan became a best-selling book editor because his book was translated into 70 languages. Absolutely not. There's value, I think, in this book for the South African context, because so many of the contributions are from a diverse South African student audience. If you want it in Spanish, this book should not be in Spanish. This book should be maybe in 12 languages of South Africa. If you want one in Spanish, you should ask someone from Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Spain. They should contribute to a book like that because it is culturally dependent. And what that means for the value of students of time series analysis, in this case, in that context, this book will not necessarily resonate with a native Spanish speaker. But it will resonate with South African speakers because times and places are described. There's a story about downtown Braamfontein, you know, in Joburg. So I think, so I said, I'm happy to give you my advice and experience about what to do and what not to do, because there's maybe one or two things, if I knew this before, I would have done it a bit differently. But yeah, it's been a hell of a journey, and I'm super grateful I actually just did it, and it turned out the way it did. I never planned on it to turn out this way, but it sure did, and I thought it turned out pretty great, and I think it's very valuable.
Yeah. Louis, do you have a question?
This is actually Annelies speaking. I would actually only thank Johan for a very informative and very interesting presentation. And even I'm not a statistician by any lengths, I really enjoyed it and I understood it. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? Yeah, we've gone a bit over time, so I think we must end. Johan, thank you very much. Really appreciate you giving your time.
I appreciate the invite, Michael. I really appreciate it. And yeah, if anybody, I'm not going to go through, if anybody's interested in having a look at the slides, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm very happy to share that with you. And then if anybody wants to dream, or if you want to repeat something like this in your class, anyone, please reach out. You don't have to, of course, but I can make maybe one or two suggestions, just beware of this stuff that I had to do afterwards that I wish I could take care of beforehand. So yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thanks, and we'll have a recording, so that's also good. I'll share it with you. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks,
have
everyone.
a good weekend.
Yes.
Cheers.
Bye.